The unique way in which Rashi addresses the nature of the prohibition against orla, the fruits in the first 3 years, gives us an incredible insight into the spiritual nature of what makes something forbidden. In Pasuk v'chisavoya la'aretz unatatem gomer, Pasuk says when you come to the land and you will plant v'araltem gomer, you have to leave things closed, period, shalosh shanim, your fruits for the first 3 years. And then the Torah repeats that they will be closed off to you and you may not eat them. So Rashi quotes the words Shalosh Shanim Yelochem Arelim, that for 3 years these fruits should be Arelim, blocked off from you. And his Mefarshi explains as follows: when do you start counting the 3 years? Mishas Neti Asoi, from the time that you plant the fruits. Then Mefarshi, as their meat made Rashi Bavornance, the Mefarshim explain that Rashi wants to illustrate to us as their meaning from the Shalom is neat, that you don't start counting the 3 years Mishasha Oise Pri, from when the tree begins to produce fruit, not Mishas Netiasa, but rather from the time that you plant it, because you might have thought it's from the time it starts to produce fruit. And das that went off from the word unetatem, say the Mefarshim, when we see that from the word in the pasuk, that is unetatem, you will plant the trees. Which tells us that, as Rashi says, you start to count from the time that you've planted. The only problem is Rashi doesn't seem to address that word at all. That from Fashtein we have to understand. First of all, is if the entire basis for explaining that you count the 3 years from the time that you plant the tree is based on that word unatatem, Rashi should have used that word as part of his title, which he didn't. And this Shaila is noch starker. This question is even more profound when you consider that the mocker from the Pirush is from Teras Kahanim. Rashi is basing his explanation on Teras Kahanim. Und dazu bringt sich Take the limit beim Shach zu die Drasha Soif und Tatem Gomer. There, the whole explanation is in fact based on the word unatatem. But Rashi is meshana from Teras Kahanim. Rashi changes the presentation from Teras Kahanim and brings us safety to Sholish Shanim Yelochem Haredim, and instead he puts the drasha associated with the words that for 3 years these fruits should be off limits. On the mountain, he doesn't mention the word unatatim at all in his introduction. That's question 1. Question 2, Beis, on the unatatim, if you don't, as Rashi doesn't mention the word unatatim, so where else in the pasuk do you see an indication that you only start to count the 3 years from when you've planted the tree if you're ignoring the word planting? And how do we not know or not imagine that the Torah is telling us 3 years of the growth of fruit? That's actually what you count. And Gimel, in Rashi. Why does Rashi use language that seems to be convoluted? Firstly, he quotes more words out of the pasuk apparently than what we need in order to know this halacha. And as well as in his words, from when does the person start counting? He could have just said simply Sholish Shanim. Could have quoted the words from the pasuk 3 years and then said Mishas Netiyase, that starts from planting. Why does it have to say from when do you begin counting? Now, you might say, oh, there's an easy answer for that because Azoyis de Lashon and Teras Kahanim, that's the language that the Teras Kahanim used. But we know very well is the Rebbe has told us multiple times, Rashi's purpose and intention when he explains the Pshat of the Psukim is not to quote the words of Midrashim verbatim. No, as Mefarash Pshuto Shel Mikra, his intention is to explain the simple understanding of the pasuk. That's why it's very common for Rashi to use different words or to leave out expressions that the Chazal used, so that he can give us the simplest understanding of the pasuk. So why is it that Rashi gets to this conclusion apparently without using the key word unatatim? The Bir and Dem explanation is this. Rashi bepassion outdod the arichas halosha in pasuk. What's bothering Rashi over here is that the pasuk seems to be repeating itself, because first it says shalosh shanim yelochem arelim, that for 3 years the fruits are off limits. Then, not first. That's what it says now in our pasuk. Shtei doch shein frir, but it already told us earlier va'aral temer lo says period that you do block the fruits from access. And so why does the pasuk have to repeat again after telling us that the fruit is off limits to say it'll be off limits for you? And why doesn't the pasuk just say in a much more efficient way that you should keep the fruits off bounds for 3 years? That alerts Rashi to the following insight. As in Orla seine Fragen zwei Inyonim, that the mitzvah of Orla actually has two sides to it. Aleph, the Isser von Orla Oifen Eitz Vehaperos Chefta. First, the Torah talks about the fact that the actual item, the fruit of the tree, is forbidden in the first 3 years. Yet you see in the words, Va'araltem Orla Soy Es Period, emphasis on the fruit. Rashi Yehe Otum V'nistam Elehonis. Remember, Rashi translates that to mean it should be blocked from us being allowed to benefit from it. So the first thing the Torah is telling us is a description of the fruit being off limits. Then, based dominion from the Shalish Shanim, then independently or separately, the Torah tells us about our mitzvahs people to count the 3 years, which is Adin from Adam Gabra. That is a law that applies to us. We have to count. Shalish Shanim yeh lochem arenim. And that's why the Torah emphasizes for 3 years it should be forbidden or off limits to you. On Das meint Rashi mit seiner Arichas Haloshen, and Rashi is drawing our attention to that by using what appears to be extra language, that you count from when you've planted it. As Davsan emphasizing the human engagement, we have to count, that the human being has to determine what the 3 years are. And because that counting of the 3 years is for you, your personal obligation with regards to Orla, is need when the 8 is oise. Well, then it's logical, if you have as a human an obligation to count years, surely that is not based on when the tree starts to produce fruit, but rather from when you, the human, got involved in this process by planting the tree. When you planted the tree, your obligation begins. That tells us another practical halachic application as well. The reason Rashi is telling us we start to count from when you plant the tree is because it's a personal obligation. So now we understand that not only do you have an obligation, but the span of that obligation, the 3 years, is not based on the movement of the tree, but rather on the experience of the person. So, the Chelek zwischen die zwei Pfannen, what's the difference if I'm looking from the perspective of the fruit or from the planter? Is ein Fall, wo man pflanzt ein Zweig von einem Baum, was ist schön alt Shalish Shanim. Let's say I took a cutting from a tree that's already more than 3 years old. I took it to my house and I planted that as the new tree in my house. So it's going to make a difference which perspective I'm looking from. If the Torah only expects me to see things from the age of the tree and its fruit, well, then I'd have a logical reason to argue that because this branch belonged to a tree that already went through the 3 years of Orla, I should be able to have whatever fruit this new tree produces immediately without having to wait, because it comes from a tree where the tree has been through 3 years. Whereas if the Torah is expecting that the 3 years of Orla are dependent on me, the planter of the tree, well, that's a whole different story. Then I, who have now planted a new tree, I have to start counting 3 years again from the time that I've planted this new tree. Which illustrates then that Rashi's simple interpretation of the Torah is in fact aligned with the practical halacha. What the din is, because the halacha is that Orla is something that you begin counting 3 years regardless of whether you are planting a new tree or if you are starting the process of the growth of a tree by taking an old branch. Either way, you'd have to take Orla, and that's Rashi's point. With that information, we can understand something else, which is actually unusual in Rashi's interpretation over here. We can address another issue which should have raised an eyebrow for us in Rashi's interpretation. Because after Rashi says, so from when you start to count it, he says from the time that you've planted, then as Rashi Mamshich, Rashi continues, and what's important is it's in Demzel and Dibra Maschil, not under a new heading, but under the same heading, with what appears to be an unrelated piece of information. So you might think, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a fruit that was from within the years of Orla, I'm going to put it away in my fridge, and I'm going to take it out after the years of Orla are okay, and maybe that's going to be acceptable. I can eat the fruit because 3 years have passed. Talmud Loimer, yeh, therefore the Torah said, yeh kol perioi, that yeh means bava yoseh, yeh, doesn't matter what I've done in the process. The fruit is fruit, which is during the early years, regardless of how much time has passed. So we have to understand in Pirish Rashi, the two things that Rashi is telling us under the same banner, under the same title, which are Aleph Moiner Lo Mishas Netiyasa, that you start counting the 3 years from when you plant the tree, and Beis Yachli Mitznir Choloi, and that if you preserve a fruit from the early years until after the early years are over, you still may not eat it. They seem to be unrelated topics. Telling us when to start counting the Orla is an interpretation of the words 3 years. Whereas the whole concept of putting away fruit for later is something we derive from different words in the Psukim, in the Pasuk Yelochem Arenim. Rashi should have done what he usually does, which is, if you're commenting on two different sets of words in the pasuk, put them into two different Rashis under two different headlines. Why doesn't he do it here? How come here Rashi puts it all into one big message, under one title? The twin them is noch starker, and in fact the question is even stronger than we originally thought, because what is Rashi's source of this idea that you can't preserve fruit from Orla till after Orla? And Perish Rashi is from Teres Kayanim, it comes from Teres Kayanim. And there the Teres Kayanim does not make it part of the conversation about how to calculate the years of Orla. No, it's its own independent concept that Teres Kayanim teaches. And why is Rashi doing something which is firstly unusual for Rashi's own style, and secondly different to the source that he's quoting, by putting these two apparently unrelated subjects under the same headline? But based on the information we already know, it actually makes perfect sense, because Al Pi Hanal, based on this movement by Pashas, it's actually very easy to understand. But the pasuk is madgish yelochem arelim, seeing, as Rashi pointed out, the second part of the pasuk is emphasizing that it's for you, personal obligation, to count the 3 years, and you can't have Orla till then. Asadin in Gavra Canal, this is a personal responsibility. So okay, it's a personal responsibility. So my personal responsibility is to wait 3 years. As long as I've counted those 3 years, that's all that I have to worry about. And the prohibition against eating those fruits is not something intrinsic to the fruit, it's just my restriction. I have to have the patience to wait 3 years. And if that would be our perspective, then these words Yelochem Arelim would mean it's not just an addition to what Orle is. When I didn't place in Gimel Shalom telling us how to calculate the years. I would have thought that actually that is the interpretation of what Orle is. Orle is a personal responsibility not to eat the fruit for 3 years. Which means I, as the planter and the potential eater of the fruit, am restricted from eating that fruit for 3 years. Therefore, if I take those fruits and put them in my freezer for 3 years, that's okay, as long as I didn't eat them for 3 years. And if I follow that logic and therefore say there's nothing intrinsic to the fruit that is problematic in those first 3 years, just me as an individual, I am restricted from eating those fruits for the first 3 years, and then I could argue logically, if the 3 year period has passed, there is no further restriction on the fruit. Even if these fruits grew during those 3 years, but now I put them in my freezer, I'd be allowed to eat them because the 3 years have gone by. I would have interpreted Orla as a personal restriction on a human being, which is for a period of time. Which is similar to chametz, right? It's during the week of Pesach that I may not eat chametz. Once Pesach is over, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with chametz. a gewissen Zman, Torahs der Odom nicht essen, I would have understood the entire nature of this mitzvah is there's a period of time that I'm not allowed to eat these fruits. And therefore I could conclude, if I would hide it away, put it in my freezer, and not touch it for 3 years, after the 3 years I'd be allowed to eat the fruits, because I've already passed the prohibition zone. Therefore, Rashi says, now that you understand there is a Isur Gavra component to Orla, we have to clarify the word Yiyeh in the Pasuk to teach us, as the Isola bleibt ständig auf die Peres, that there is also a prohibited element to the fruits themselves, even when the time frame is passed, and therefore the fruits sitting in my freezer for those 3 years, I may not eat even after the Orla is over. That's why Rashi puts both of those messages in the same title, because they're effectively the same principle that has these two components. So now let's look spiritually. What is the difference between this Isur Gavra and Isur Chefetz? And it tells us a beautiful insight into how spiritual contamination works, or prohibition works. The Tam Pnimi von dem Chelek zwischen Isur Gavra and Isur Chefetz. So what's the spiritual difference between whether the prohibition is on the item or the user? Hängt ab von wann das kommt der Chais von der Davar Hanesar. So it's all going to depend on what's giving energy and vitality to the particular item that is forbidden. Isurei cheftzei, if I have something which the item itself is forbidden, as a chefetz farzich is aser, the food is treif, the item is shatnez. It's something which fundamentally is prohibited. That means that that particular item receives its vitality from absolute impurity, from the 3 impure, unsalvageable klippas. Where we don't have a mechanism to be able to return or elevate that reality to Kedusha, so therefore it's osur, it's off bounds. That's why the item is forbidden, and indefinitely, because it has no way to rehabilitate. Whereas Isur Gavra is, but if there's something that I am not allowed to have, Chometz on Pesach, a Nazir with wine, that means that the item belongs to or is vitalized by Klippas Noiga. For Klippas Noiga was Kenny Salavan and Kedusha, which means it has potential, using the right circumstances and approach, to be elevated and to become holy. On that far is that's why the item is not fundamentally prohibited. Now the it's just that the person in certain circumstances may not utilize it, because the person doesn't yet have the capacity, or it's the wrong time, to be able to elevate it to holiness. So it's really important for us to understand that the fruits of a tree in the first 3 years, those fruits are fundamentally treif. They are impure. They are vitalized by Klippa. As the Alter Rebbe points out in Tanya, the life force of fruit, even though the rest of history would be edible, during those 3 years, the life force of that fruit is absolute impurity, and therefore completely out of bounds for us. The only question is, how does that work? That you have a tree which is fundamentally permitted, producing fruit which is fundamentally prohibited, and then of course later fruit which is again permitted. We need to understand. The tree itself is something which is permitted according to Torah. And of course, the fruit derives its vitality surely from the tree. That's the biology of it. So how's it possible that the tree should be something which is okay and permitted? But the fruit that are produced by that tree, nourished by that tree, should be forbidden. If there was such a thing as a tree that produces non-kosher fruit that would never be kosher, that would make sense. We could explain. Then we would say that the element of vitality that the tree produces, which is the source of these fruits, that is a contaminated part of the energy of the tree. So the bark of the tree, the wood of the tree would be, so to speak, fundamentally acceptable and kosher. And it's just that particular nourishment of the fruit that would be no good. But that's not what's happening over here. After 3 years have passed, the fruit of this tree will be completely kosher, completely permissible. That means that the nourishment of these fruits is not coming from impure clippers. How on earth do these fruits become completely impure during that 3-year period? It seems to be completely illogical. So to understand that, we're going to pay attention to a nuance in the Alter Rebbe's language. In the Lashon von Alter Rebbe in Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe gives the example of produce which is forbidden, he says, there the Alter Rebbe uses the expression that the vitality and the sustaining of these fruits comes from klippa, from absolute impurity. So the Rebbe Rashab points out as that when the Alter Rebbe is describing fruit, produce that is forbidden, he doesn't say that the sustaining of their being, of their body, of their physicality comes from impurity, which is the language that he used about impure or non-kosher animals. What the Alter Rebbe sagt, as nicht bloß seine Nefoshes, there the Alter Rebbe says not only is the soul of a non-kosher animal from an impure source, but the body as well. Is von Kimo Klippus Atmeus, the body of the non-kosher animal is generated by and nourished and sustained by impurity. Says the Rebbe Rashab on his Mazvar Shari Gufim Fonor Chulei Torah Chulei, says the Rebbe Rashab, that's because the actual physical material of the fruit is in fact acceptable, it's permissible. So that doesn't seem to make sense. We know that fruit, which was produced during the earlier years, is forbidden indefinitely. Exactly, I suppose, like a non-kosher animal. So surely the fruit, which is always impure, always off limits, surely is always from a source of impurity, of absolute klippa. And if you're going to argue, well, the issue over here is that these fruits are derived from a tree, where the tree is actually permissible, well then, as we've already said, the vitality of the fruit comes from the tree. The tree is fine. So what's going on over here? How is the fruit completely treif, but the tree that produces is completely kosher? Is the bir in them the chilek from kim gufam and kim chayus is. So to understand this, we need to understand the difference between energy that causes the being to exist, as the Alter Rebbe describes with non-kosher animals, or that creates the energy of impurity, as he describes with non-kosher produce. The gufa geshem von anivra is vashavim givarim b'lo zein mol. The physical body of any created being occurs once. On the noch is when the freedom and then the rest of its lifespan is just a sustaining of its original form. On the far is and therefore the item cannot really change. An animal that was born non-kosher, that's what it is. It's non-kosher forever. It's not possible to rewire what made this animal's body exist in the first place, and therefore now it should become kosher. Whereas the life force that's keeping it alive in this moment, not that made it what it is, but that's keeping it in existence in this moment, that is being renewed constantly. As all over Chassidus, we interpret the line we say in our davening, that the Eibishter renews the process of creation daily, constantly. That every single day and consistently through the day, there is brand new energy being pumped into the world. What if it's a new energy at every moment? It could be a completely, radically different chayas at any given moment. That's exactly what's happening with the prohibition against Orla. The guf v'geshem or ilam v'sisadavar tohor bleibt tohor. When the Eibishter created that particular tree, it was always the fundamental fabric of the tree was permissible, pure. And that's never going to change. The tree can never be treifed. Because the nature of the so-called body of something that was created can never alter. The Gabevi has given free, it can't be different to what it was originally. But now from that tree, there's going to be new vitality and nutrition going into the leaves and the branches and the fruits on a regular basis. During the 3 years of Orla, that flow of sustaining energy from tree to fruit, the energy is contaminated and impure, which makes those fruits fundamentally impure because they were generated by that temporary energy of impurity. And then after the 3 years are over, as Hashem breathes new life into the tree, as He does consistently through creation, the new energy that comes into the tree, that produces fruits in the 4th year. Not only fruits that are now permissible, in other words, no longer locked into the world of impurity, but actually those fruits are holy and have to be eaten in a specific context as part of our service of the Eibishter, because there's a new chayas and a new energy in that fruit at that time.